Cambridge Analytica data scandal. Carole has won other awards, including the British Journalism Awards Technology Journalism Award in December 2017 and the Orwell Prize for Political Journalism in 2018. She is the author of The Family Tree, published in 2006 and was shortlisted for the 2006 Commonwealth Writers' Prize. She is currently at work on a new book. Over to you, Manuel.
Thank you, Carole, for joining us. I'll be calling you with your first name because you're the journalist with the most unpronounceable surname this side of Sri Lanka. So yeah, that's why I'll never get it wrong. And this might get dark pretty quickly. So before that, your first award is for novel, for fiction. So enough of that fun. How did you get into investigative journalism?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. And first of all, to say thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to Republica for inviting me. And I feel very honoured to be here on this very special anniversary and really touched, actually, so thank you. And I think the people. And then what happened is that in 2016, essentially, it was actually a week before the US election when Trump got elected, I kind of got turned onto this, like something weird is happening on the internet. And there were various things which I sort of clocked, and I was like, well, technology is being used in a really different way here. And then when the election happened, and we had those first reports about fake news. I don't know if you remember that. But you know, back then it was people were like, "What is this fake news? This is a few articles, whatever." Anyway, I wrote a big article about it in November 2016. It was a couple of weeks after Trump was elected, and I just fell down this rabbit hole into this, you know, bizarre world that was incredibly disturbing. And I tell the story sometimes of that what my first sort of entry point was, because it is the thing which kind of keeps me going in some respects, which was that I started looking at Google search, and I was trying to work out how Google search worked. And, you know, it was a very dark night in November. Donald Trump had just been elected. And I started testing words in Google, and I put in, for some reason, anyway, I was testing out different words, and I put Jews in the search bar. And then Google encourages you to make it into a question. So I typed, "Are Jews?" And you know how Google gives you suggestions of what you're looking for? So the first suggestion that Google gave me was, "Are Jews evil?" And I was like, whoa, this is really weird, you know, and I pressed return, and I got an entire page linking to websites I'd never heard of, and every single one of them linked through to an article which said, yes, Jews are evil. And then the suggestion for the next thing to search for, you know, Google gives you a little box on the side. It's suggested, do you want to search for, did the Holocaust really happen? And so I clicked on that, and the top search result was to Stormfront, which is a Nazi website. And the entire page was Holocaust denial. And I just had no idea what I was looking at. And I tried it on lots of other searches, and, you know, including one, I put women in and asked the same question, are women? And the answer, Google was so confident of the answer, it put it in a box at the top. It's called a knowledge box. And the answer was, yes, all women are evil because every woman has a small degree of prostitute inside her. And then essentially what happened is I stumbled across an academic in America. It's a guy called Jonathan Albright. And he was equally as freaked out as me. And he had been trying to map. He'd got a list of some of these first fake news sites we knew about, and he tried to map them. And he built this sort of systems map. And I talked to him on the telephone, And he was like, people have just got this wrong. It's not, it's not this idea of these are fake stories. It's just like, it's a few stories. He said, this is a system. And you can see that it's drowning out the mainstream sources of information. So it's drowning out The Guardian, and it's drowning out, and you could see it on his map. And he was like, it's like a cancer. It's kind of taken over the internet. And that was, and I was like, the internet has cancer, Jonathan. And I was like, how long has it been out there? How long has this been there? And it was like nobody knew, because, we didn't know. Just like all through 2016, essentially, that, the internet had been poisoned. And what happened is I wrote this first article, and it, caused a kind of sensation. But then nothing happened. I think it's this sort of I was kind of like, oh, it's a massive scandal. It went hugely viral. But Google was still denying there was any problem. And nothing happened. And so then I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to have to write about it next week as well. So this was when I normally I just wrote a big feature article and I moved on. And this time I was like, there are Nazis on the internet. This is not okay. I'm not going to sit there whilst we have Holocaust denial being promoted by Facebook. Anyway, and then that first article was set everything off because, Jonathan had also said to me, oh, and there's companies like Cambridge Analytica which can use these fake news networks. So that's and I was like, what do you mean? And he said, well, what they can do is that you will see an ad on Facebook, for example. You click on, you read it, it takes you to one of these websites that embeds something in your computer, and then it can follow you around the internet, and then it uses that information then to target you in an election.
Because I'm not a doctor, but a cancer happens to you. This sounds like something someone puts there. It's a cancer that someone's put on the internet. It's not a spontaneous problem, is it?
No, it's built.
So there are bad guys here.
And the whole thing is there are still so many unknown questions. And, that was all, the whole thing of what happened in 2016 happened in this total darkness. And we have no way of, so we now know much more because of journalism, because of academia, because of because of the FBI investigation. But we still don't actually, we still don't actually know what people were seeing in those elections and who was targeted and how. And this is the same for every other election in the world also, including Malta, of which there are many links between what I was looking at and between what was happening here and specifically what Daphne was looking at.
Okay, we'll get there. We'll get to Malta, but let's stay in the rest of the world for a while. You started working on this, you said, 2 weeks after the Trump election. Was that because you had a feeling that there was something strange about someone like Trump winning an election? Were you trying to explain something that didn't just add up?
No, it was really specific. It was because I had been writing these stories about technology, and a week, more or less 10 days before the US election, there were 3 stories just which came across, I saw, and I was like, something is wrong here. And it was 3 stories, which was, one was that I read this story in Wired magazine about these teenagers in Montenegro who were writing fake news stories on Facebook for money, saying things like, the Pope has endorsed Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton is a charlatan. And so there was this little, that was one story. And then there was another story about how there had been a cyber attack on an African country which took the internet completely offline. And it was being theorized that this was a dry run for doing this ahead of an election to a country. And then the third story was about WikiLeaks, and that there was this, there was another big WikiLeaks dump of Hillary Clinton's emails, 10 days or whatever it was before the US election. And it just made me think, well, that's and I was like, well, if that's the world we live in now, like all of the technology, and I was like, I'd just been at this conference in San Francisco where they kept on talking about technology disrupts things. You know, it's disrupted the music
And they mean it
industry.
in a good way.
Yeah, they mean it in a great way. Well, it is, yes and no. You know, it disrupted journalism, and that's why there's no money in journalism. But it disrupted the music industry, and that's why we have Spotify. And, you know, there was this whole... And I sort of suddenly realised there's all this weird... And I was like, oh, OK, technology is now disrupting politics. And then I was like, well, if it's disrupting elections, essentially. We're seeing here is a technological disruption of elections. And if we're disrupting elections, we are disrupting democracy. And I wrote this piece I was like, somebody must have written this. And I Googled and nobody had. And so I wrote this just an op-ed before the election. And then there was, like I said, there was a shock result, but immediately we started realizing that there was these other darker forces at play.
Anne spoke about I think certainly how I became aware of you, but what made you famous, which was the TED Talk you gave in 2019. And in there, you tell the story of reporting the aftermath of the Brexit referendum.
Mm.
So you go back home, you go back to Wales, to South Wales, and to speak to people and ask them why they voted the way they did. Because you would have thought, they were turkeys voting for Christmas. They were voting against their own interests. Mm. It's a place that did well, as an EU member territory. So I want you to tell me a bit about that, and because that very quickly leads back to your findings about how technology is disrupting the democratic process.
So, the Brexit referendum in Britain was a shock, and it wasn't predicted. It was nobody thought it was going to happen. And on the day afterwards, I was supposed to be, my mum, I grew up in Wales, and my mum still lives there. And I was going back to actually write a report about a football match. And then they were like, no, go and visit somewhere and write about, the impact, like what people are saying about Brexit. And and I went to this very poor industrial community. It used to have a massive steelworks there, which was closed in the 1980s. It's a very, very poor area. But the last time I'd been to this place, Ebbw Vale, that's what it looked like. It was, very poor, very depressed. Anyway, and I drove back into town, and it was just unrecognisable because there was just all this building which had been gone on with, and everywhere there was, big signs kind of paid for by the EU. So there was there's a really amazing sports centre and an amazing college and a new railway and a new motorway, and had lots and lots of infrastructure being paid for by the EU. And in Wales, the thing is, it's a really heartland Labour, sort of left-wing community who hates the Conservatives and the sort of right-wing, whatever. And this was where they'd had the highest Leave vote in the country. And, and the main message of Brexit was, it was like taking back control, and it was this really, really anti-immigration message. And, the other weird thing about that area was that there was no immigration there at all. So it was, and so just trying to understand, why people had, and nobody reads right-wing newspapers there. So it was like, where are they getting their information from? And that was when I sort of realised, there's something else is going on here. People have, and and I was contacted by somebody, and they sort of said, well, it was just Facebook was awash with it. And
Facebook was awash with?
Facebook was awash with fear-mongering, fake news adverts, which were telling lies to voters, ahead of this critical election, which has changed Britain's history and the EU's, the future of the EU as well, forever. And it was totally invisible. Journalists did not see these messages because they're only being directed to individuals. So the national press had no idea what was going on. And And we still don't know really. We've now seen some of the adverts, and they say they literally tell lies. It's all about how Turkey is joining the European Union, and millions of immigrants are going to be storming towards Britain at any moment. And the other great lie they had was that all of the money which we currently spend to give to the European Union is now going to be funding our NHS. We're going to have great hospitals and...
Yeah, but there was a buzz saying that.
It wasn't just on the internet. Yeah, that's true.
No,
that's true. Yeah, you're right. The racism was confined. The real overt racism was confined to the internet.
So there's a bit of a continuum in the messaging, isn't there?
Yeah.
So there's the polite version, which is in the public sphere, but it's sort of enabling and complementing the unspeakable things that are spoken on Facebook and addressed directly to the viewer, aren't they?
And can be just outright lies. I mean, there is nothing to stop, and you can't, and they knew they would never be held to account for it because it was invisible. It's not archived anywhere. It's not, I don't know what the rules are, but in Britain, every single leaflet which a political party puts out, it has to say on it who's paying for that leaflet, and a copy of that leaflet gets put into our national libraries. It's there forever. It can be searched and researched and whatever. 1 billion ads were put out on Facebook. We know that in the lead up to the referendum. Not a single one of which is now, sort of searchable in that way. We've got no idea who saw what. We have no idea who paid for those ads. We've got no idea how much money was spent. And that, again, is the same in your elections,
I'm delaying the gratification of discussing that because I really want to get...
I know, I like the way you're building it.
I really want to get to grips with the implications of this. Because basically what you're saying is there are ways, invisible ways, hidden ways, unaccountable ways to get people to vote in elections against their own interests, that in ways that they wouldn't do in a pre-internet circumstance.
Yeah, so, I mean, in a really, really short space of time, elections changed completely. The game used to be TV, billboards, like somebody knocking on your door. Now, and that's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's difficult. Now, you don't have to knock on somebody's door. You can just bombard them with ads.
And lie to them.
And lie to them. And, it's not just Facebook ads, it's also, the sort of other ads on you can be targeted in so many different ways. And, and it's reinforced.
Okay, so there's this brand name which, I think you could say you made famous. They did their advertising in a rather more quiet fashion. Cambridge Analytica, it's a firm that does not exist anymore. It had a different name before, but same owners. I think we need to refresh our memory a bit. Tell us, what part did they play and how do they fit into the story? What did they do?
So Cambridge Analytica was a company which was set up in 2015 to work for political campaigns in elections, doing very clever digital stuff, using masses and masses of data to profile people and then target them. But the company came out of this much older company called SCL, which didn't just do elections, it also did military contracting. So SCL had worked in Iraq and Afghanistan and across the globe, working...
Let me interrupt you for a second. Yes, you've got... Can we have the handheld mic, please, so that we can... Because, I mean, I know we can hear us, but we're putting this out on Facebook.
Ah,
and that
there
way.
we go.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's much better, yeah.
Yeah, so it was just sort of extraordinary that this company which ended up working in these elections had previously been working in war zones, and working in war zones paid for by the British government and the American government and NATO. They were doing information warfare. I mean, information, so you know that the whole strategy with militaries is, as well as going and, you know, bombing people, using tanks, using weaponry, you're commanding the land, but you're also trying to command, and the airspace, but you're also trying to command the fifth dimension, which is the information space. And that is really, really critical in warfare. And it's still really critical in warfare, and you can see that in Russia and Ukraine. So one of the things which is, you know, really fascinating about what's going on now, Russia as a nation state really understood this, and they were the first nation state really to understand how you can use the social media platforms to mess with people's head. And that's what, in 2014, they did in Ukraine before they invaded. So it's a really powerful military tool. And I think what you have to, you know, remember, I mean, I think this was one of the things which all through, you know, I broke the Cambridge Analytica story in 2018, but I'd been reporting on it for a year beforehand. And people, I had a lot of like tech bros, I call them. The tech bros were kind of, their argument was like, they all do it, it doesn't work, and you know, it's just sort of doing clever things with data. There's nothing unusual there. And you know, sitting in London where this company had been based, it was like, no, this is not usual. You don't use military technologies in elections. There is something like really problematic with that. And you know, and the question I just kept on asking was, is it legal? Is it legal? And that was, you know, as I sort of said, the technology journalists were sort of ignoring that. You know, and it turned out that it wasn't legal, actually, what they did in Britain and what they did in America.
Okay, so we understand I think I understand what they do in war zones, right?
Yeah.
So this is basically, instead of bombardment with bombs, it's bombardment with words.
Exactly.
Doesn't matter if they're true, as long as you get people to do what you want them to do.
And it's much cheaper than buying a tank. Facebook ads are much, much cheaper than, you know,
I never tried buying a
missile.
tank, but yeah. Okay, so I understand what they do in war zones. What are they doing? What's the application of this technology then well, they would call it a war zone, but in London or in Wales or in Iowa? What are they doing?
So this is something fundamental that has changed about politics, and it's changed about politics forever in that way. In that politics, in the way that we have traditionally practiced it for, you know, centuries at least, it's about public debate. It's about open, you know, political parties tell you what their policies are, and then they might go on television or they answer questions from journalists, and they have manifesto promises. This is how we conducted politics. This is not the way we conduct politics now. Now what happens is people are being targeted in darkness with lies which are trying to sort of invisibly manipulate them, to coerce them. So the thing about, you know, information warfare, information operations, is you're trying to coerce people against their will and against their knowledge even, that they don't even realise that they're being manipulated in this way. And that is the sort of nub, I think, of where it's not, you know, there's a lot of people who would go, well, it's, you know, this thing of like, it's just ads, you know, it's just adverts. Adverts don't work on me. But it's, you know, there is something much more insidious here.
Back to that talk. You said something there which chilled me when I heard it, and I quote it to whoever is willing to hear, and even some people who aren't. You said, you wondered, you looked up and you wondered if we can ever have free and fair elections again. Now that was 2019, so I think Trump was still in power, right? So it was, but Brexit is, you know, Brexit is still Brexit, and it means what it means. But do you still think so? Do you still think that Western liberal democracy operated through the free exercise of the ballot is a thing of the past?
Currently, yes. I mean, there are things that we can do. There are things that countries can do. But at the moment, social media, the platforms, They are, they are a threat surface, is what you call them. So they are a sort of open platform which bad actors can exploit in invisible ways with money from, wherever, and target a population, and they are not safe. Our elections are not safe. And, the kind of disappointing and infuriating thing in Britain is that, we documented this, and actually, we had a really good parliamentary report which set it down and said, we have to have an inquiry, we have to reform our electoral laws, we have to hold the technology companies to account, and none of it happened.
Okay, so they can do it, and they've done it in big elections, in the biggest, most sophisticated, most ancient democracies of the world. In the United States, they've influenced the vote. They've done it in the UK. They've influenced the Brexit vote. But they've done it in smaller places as well, haven't they?
I mean, so small countries, small island nations were something that I looked at in relation with Cambridge Analytica. So, and the place where they had long association and had worked for many years was in the Caribbean. And one election that I was looking at, two elections I looked at particularly, was in St. Kitts and Nevis. And there you have a tiny population.
56,000, something like that, isn't it?
I think it's, is it 70,000?
Is it that many? Okay.
No, it's not. I mean, it's tiny. And the Alexander Nix once said to me, I met him once.
Alexander Nix is?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Alexander Nix is the CEO of Cambridge Analytica.
I actually know someone who knows him, or who met him once.
This is I know, we have a story coming out here, which is very exciting. But he said to me, the thing is, in some of these places in the Caribbean, it feels like you can touch every voter. And you can.
We know the feeling.
I mean, that is the thing, is that for a really small amount of money, there is huge amounts of things that you can do.
Okay, so why would anyone want, presumably, just leave aside the person who wants to be Prime Minister of St. Kitts. So, of course, he would want to influence the outcome of the vote there. But why would anyone from outside St. Kitts want to change the outcome of an election there?
Well, so through 2017, when I was trying to make sense of this story and what on earth was going on, and I started looking at these Caribbean elections, pretty much straight away, I learnt of the presence of this big company, Henley & Partners.
Now, where have I heard of them?
Which had done a deal with the government of St. Kitts for investor passports. And the question of how St. Kitts had paid for an enormously flashy election, which I think $5 million went into.
That's a lot of money for 70,000 people.
Imagine what you were doing from that. And, extraordinary stories of what was happening in that election, including, I had a source who told me that his job was standing on the runway at the airport as they brought in charter flights of people, diaspora, from all around the world, who were given a free holiday in St. Kitts for coming to vote, who would contribute towards the election campaigns of the party, which won.
And which would then introduce a policy?
Which then they introduced a policy, they introduced it quite a long time ago, St. Kitts,
okay.
But yes. But yeah, they've worked from right from the beginning. St. Kitts was the first place that Henley & Partners
we actually know someone
got the contract.
We actually know someone who has more than one passport with multiple dates of birth from St. Kitts and Nevis. His name does not sound Kittitian. It's Ali Sadr Hashemi Nejad, but there it is.
And there are a lot of criminals, essentially. That's one thing we know about the people who got St. Kitts passports.
Speaking of Ali Sadr.
I didn't say that, by the way.
No. This is
don't let me libel somebody I don't even know.
No. Ali Sadr knows my number. Okay. When was this in St. Kitts?
I think they had an election in 2013, I think, and there was an election in 2000 and, actually it was 2015 and 2011, I think. 2015, I think, was the, yeah. And including, can I tell you one other story? Can I tell you one other story? Because it's something to... So one other story about what happened in the election in St Kitts. I was very obsessed with an election Cambridge Analytica worked on in Nigeria. And one of the hallmarks, the special hallmarks of that election, was that they worked alongside a team of Israeli hackers. So it was they were an intelligence firm for hire from Israel, and they hacked the now presidents of Nigeria's emails and then leaked them to the press. And those emails were handed over to Cambridge Analytica employees to look at, to try and find the dirt, to then make into adverts and to leak to the press. And that team of Israeli hackers also worked in the St Kitts election.
Nice.
And, yeah.
Can someone give the other microphone to Paul here? Should be somewhere here, no? Yeah. There was a phase in your life, Paul, when you were Secretary General of the Nationalist Party.
Yes, there was a phase which started, I think, roughly in 2010, when the Nationalist Party back then in government had scrapped a high net worth residence scheme, thinking to reintroduce a scheme which made better sense for Malta. And that was the time when Christian Kalin came to knock at my office, offering a better scheme for Malta, but possibly a better scheme for himself. And it didn't take much time for us to understand, after having discussed it internally with the party, and back then, Lawrence Gonzi as Prime Minister, to say, thank you very much, your services are not required. Then, in about December 2012, October 2012, Alexander Nix had knocked at my door again, offering the service of a subsidiary company, if I remember well, it's SCL, to offer campaign services. And I think that was roughly at a fee of about £120,000 sterling. We had about 1 or 2 meetings before we understood what they were after, and in fact we had shared some data with them. I mean, basically they were surveys that we were gathering, which was quite public knowledge, to be quite honest, so we didn't really give out any or divulge any information that was not public knowledge. As you say, when I made my search, one of the directors, I think, was a former Conservative Party State Undersecretary for Defence. I can't remember the name. Because when we discussed it internally, I said, listen, these have contacts with the Conservative Party in the UK, so it made a little bit of sense. But going through their proposal, and I actually have the proposal that they had made and even referred to St. Kitts as an example, we made 1 + 1. And back after the second meeting, which I think was held in December 2012, we said, thank you very much, your services are no longer required. My hunch is that they had already tapped the Labour Party before trying to engage with us, but they were knocking at our doors only to try and source information from us. But that was the relationship, the very short relationship that the Nationalist Party, or I had, with both Alexander Nix and...
And did you make a connection between the two at the time?
No, I did not make the connection because Christian Kalin came in about 2010, and there was no reference back then to them. He was really, for me at least, a person who went back under the radar. I mean, he never knocked
For the
third of
record, the Labour Party says they never met them. So
Okay.
I think that should be said. Okay, so that after that interlude, and thank you for that, Paul. I want to ask you a few questions about the process of bringing that story out, and specifically breaking it with those very dramatic pictures of the whistleblower in the story,
Yeah.
Christopher Wiley.